We're going to be talking just in the round about some cases and about your view on detection and about how techniques of detection, in particular forensic science, have changed the characteristic of detective work in the 21st century, but also how seminal cases in the 20th century prompted all of those changes. So, I mean, from your experience, we're going to be looking at Ripper, we're going to talk about Wendy-speakes, we're going to talk about Christopher Farrow, and of course John Humble as well, how John Humble was traced through DNA to illustrate that. But also the case that you mentioned, which was in Leeds with the women who were abducted in cars, Clive Barwell.
Yeah.
So yeah, we can talk a bit about that. So the first question really is, what do you think nowadays makes a good detective constable? Somebody who's going into CID for the first time, what makes a good DC?
I think what makes a good detective constable is a person who will work with other more experienced detectives, will pick up the good points off them. They will become unique in their own way because they may pick good points up of several different people. It's important to remember one thing, which is, as far as a detective is concerned, there is no room for hunches. You have to follow the evidence. So you've got to be quite strict and self-composed in how you deal with investigations. A good detective obviously needs a good leader. And I've always said, you may be the senior investigating officer. One day you'll go see the chief constable and he promotes you superintendent. You don't get any better ideas the day you're promoted than you did the day before. So a senior officer is about managing your team. You know, I would say it's like Andre Previn. You know, the orchestra plays well, he takes all the accolades. So even the most inexperienced detective on a team can come up with the best idea. And that is what I always look for. So I would encompass all the detectives on the team. And strangely enough, when you had a meeting, some of the detectives were a little bit shy of speaking up in front of the rest of the group. And occasionally we may go for a drink afterwards and somebody would approach me and say, I've had this idea, boss. And that's where the good ideas come from. They come from those young, good detectives who are learning the skill.
I'm thinking about the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry immediately and George Oldfield's approach, which I think was diametrically opposed to that, wasn't it?
Yes, I have been very critical of George Oldfield. I think what I learnt from working on the cases that George Oldfield was in charge of was of how not to do it. There was no room for anybody to make suggestions from the lower ranks. And there were several good suggestions. I mean, one of the detectives who I worked with, Detective Constable, he said, why don't they look at the what was known as the Canadian system, which was a geographical plotting system. And the principle behind it was that the offender would travel to avoid detection. So the first attacks were more likely to be close to home. The other thing about working on the Ripper case is they couldn't get their head around the fact that some of the victims could have survived. And of course, not recognising that, there was a massive loss of evidence. One of the victims in Chapeltown, I think her last name was Monroe, she did the artist's impression of Dave. He used the name Dave.
Yeah.
And she was just dismissed. And that was probably the closest picture that anybody produced of Sutcliffe. So you weren't part of your team. And I remember when another colleague went and said, I used to be a heavy goods vehicle driver. Josephine Whittaker, which is Savile Park, the footprints, one of the boots showed heavy wear. And they said, that's what my boots were like as a heavy goods vehicle driver. One boot used to wear out before the other. And we just told, get on with your work. And what was our work? Our work was eliminating people on criteria that wasn't correct, because he didn't have a Geordie accent, as we find out in the end. So we weren't looking for the person. We were eliminating millions and millions of people who it couldn't have been on dubious data, because at the end of the day, we were seeing people and say, where were you 3 years ago on Tuesday? Well, I usually did this. I usually did that. Say, well, who can verify that? Well, wife will tell you. What did you normally do on a Tuesday? Well, it's not what you normally did that we're interested in, it's what you did do. So you couldn't eliminate people. And people, and what's one of the major factors that came out of that is that this gradient of elimination, you know, like the top grade for eliminating somebody was forensic. And getting eliminated on the word of your spouse, no good at all.
Was this a failure of strategy, or a failure of vision, or a failure of management?
I think vision and management, because surely there had to be other people who were within his pod of senior officers, his management team, who must have had doubts, but we never heard any doubts voiced.
Was it Hobson was concerned when the plug was pulled on the tyre tracing part of the inquiry, which, depending on your view, I mean, was that more or less flawed? It seems they were starting at the big end of the telescope and trying to narrow it down.
Yeah.
You know, how would you have done that? Was that a cock-up?
Well, what I would have done, and of course, we did do, when we were looking for Michael Sam's car, right, was to say, right, how many red Metros are there? Right, 200,000. Right, do a quick analysis. If we set a team up and we give them 2 hours a day overtime, how long will it take us to complete that inquiry? It would have taken us 20 years, obviously on the assumption that nobody ever sold the vehicle. So it wasn't a viable line of inquiry. If only we had have known it was an automatic, there was only a few hundred.
Because of his leg?
Yeah. But things like that. So now you would look at and say, is that a viable line of inquiry? Is it a worthwhile line of inquiry? So you've got to look at what evidence you've got and look at the probability. So of course that the tyres were not that many cars, and that could have been a viable line of inquiry. Because what you're looking for, and of course, and this was the same thing with Sam's, you're looking for threads. None of the individual threads may in themselves be significant, but when you get 1, 2, 3, 4 pointing at a suspect, then he becomes a person of interest. And of course, the biggest letdown, of course, which I can't blame George Oldfield for, was the fact that it took a minimum of 3 weeks for a piece of paper to go through that system. So if I was given an inquiry to go see Peter-Sutcliffe, I would not have all the information with me, because there could be paperwork in the system. Whereas, of course, now with a computerized system such as Holmes, you will be able to see everything relating to that person before you went to see them. And I think that would have raised the level of suspicion. So a major inquiry like that really was bound to be flawed by using a paper-based system.
What happened in the Ripper incident room on a day-to-day basis in terms of managing the staff, managing the questions that were being asked, managing who was going to ask a particular person a particular thing on that day, from which division they were going, whether they were Greater Manchester, whether they were West Yorkshire, all of those day-to-day things. How was that coordinated, or was it coordinated?
Well, basically, no, it wasn't, because actions would come out. I mean, one of the first things that you look at is offenders, you know, with a violent background. And of course, every time there's a murder, these same people get seen. And that, depending on how many people there are, can be very time consuming, because you've got to find them. And it wasn't really managed, because the system spewed out what they referred to as actions, and they were just allocated to people. People operating from different incident rooms in different areas, in different forces, would have actions allocated to them that related to their force area. But it was split because we had whatever murder it was on, say, and when it started to get into the latter end, when I was on the Margarita Walls at Pudsey, we had two incident rooms. One was looking for the murder of Margarita Walls, and the other one was dealing with Yorkshire Ripper inquiries. And literally you would get people ringing up who'd say, well, I think it's somebody in, you know, a wetsuit. This is why they're not leaving evidence. So, you know, you get, what can you do with that? Right, well, have we got any scuba diver clubs and anything like that? But, you know, it stretches the credibility. There's a guy walking around in a, you know, in a scuba diving suit. Or I think it's the gnome at the bottom of my garden. So if he hadn't been caught, there was still years of work to do, because you are looking in this morass of information for the golden nugget. But when that golden nugget comes, you've got to be able to recognise it for what it is. And the threads that were going to Peter-Sutcliffe weren't being pulled together.
In terms of nuggets, the photo fits were, I think there were 6 nuggets all there on a wall, and the moment you looked at those and compared them, anybody with eyes in their head would have been able to draw the conclusion that this was a picture of the same man. Nobody did that.
Yeah.
Why not?
I think because it was they're not, you know, it's not the same as having a photograph of somebody. You know, I think there was a...
Well, the hair and the way the eyes
yeah,
were, and the beard, which he never shaved off.
Yeah, I think one of the things is they didn't want to believe it. I remember when Margarita Walls was found, and of course the way that he killed Margarita Walls was different. Still struck her with a hammer, but she'd been strangled. And of course, I remember him saying, right, we don't want anybody making comments that this is linked to the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry. I remember saying at one of the meetings, well, if it isn't, we've got 2 maniacs out there murdering women. But, you know, we had to keep them all separate. And of course, ultimately it was. And
so that very slight change in MO ruled out that particular murder.
Initially, yes.
Initially from the Ripper inquiry. And at the same time, I'm just visualising this, on the wall behind George Oldfield, there are these photographs or photo fits of the same person, effectively, described by different people who'd survived attacks, and 2 officers had been to his house in Heaton, and he'd been interviewed on 9 separate occasions by the police, and yet nobody actually put 2 and 2 together and said, hang on a second, that looks just like the bloke we were interviewing yesterday.
Yeah. Well, there was one.
How does that happen? How does that happen?
Well, it shouldn't happen, and it's a lack of communication, because when challenged by one officer, they really didn't want to know, you know, because they were seeing it differently. Because
this is George Oldfield and Dick Holland who were running the inquiry.
Yeah, there were other people part of that management team.
Yeah.
But yeah, if they didn't see it that way, and of course he didn't have a Geordie accent. And that was one of the eliminations. And I remember that they'd got what was then the uniform branch called the task force, had been drafted in, and they'd ring you up and go, are you Bob Taylor? Yeah. You haven't got a Geordie accent? No. Right, you're eliminated. That was as simple as that. So that failure, by introducing an elimination criteria that was basically, it was wrong, undermined the whole investigation.
That is astonishing though, isn't it? Because apart from anything else, there was no evidence to suggest that the I'm Jack tape and the letters were anything other than a hoax.
What you have to remember is that at that time, the senior investigating officer, including the management team, would likely hold back information from the investigation team. So we knew that the information, the I'm Jack, had all been in a paper in Manchester. Right, so we knew it was in the public domain, but we thought that there was something in the tape that made them, that they hadn't disclosed, that made them know it was him. That's, you know, how we that's the only way I could believe it. You see, I never withheld anything from any of my detectives. Now, obviously, you're at risk on that, on something being leaked to the media, but you've got to. They're your representatives. Each one of those detectives knocking on the door is a representative of the senior investigating officer, and he has to know the same information. Otherwise, he's not going to be able to find and recognise that golden nugget when he finds it.
Just let me clarify, you were a detective sergeant at this point, were you? Or a DC, I can't remember.
I was a DC when on the first 3 murders.
Right.
I was exhibit officer on the second and third murders. So I was very involved because I was at the post-mortem and dealing with all the exhibits. So, and then they whisked me off to detective training school because although I'd been in CID about 6 years, I'd never been. And they decided I couldn't get promoted until I had been, and I actually was promoted while I was on the course. So then I came back into uniform, 12 months in uniform, I think about, just a little over 12 months, so back in CID.
And then back onto the Ripper inquiry.
Yeah.
And just circling back to the situation with Greater Manchester Police, who were investigating one murder that was attributed to what was Sutcliffe, and the West Yorkshire investigation that was dealing with the others. You're saying that West Yorkshire thought that Greater Manchester had some hunch or some nugget of information about the Wearside Jack tape that they were holding on to. They weren't telling West Yorkshire that information. So based on that assumption, West Yorkshire assumed again that there was some significance to the tape which really wasn't there.
Well, I don't know if that's what if they thought they were holding something back, but nobody, as it transpires, nobody was. But again,
I maybe misunderstood you there.
Yeah,
it's just it sounded as though everybody was assuming that everybody else was
like
a game of blackjack. You know?
Yeah, we assumed that the senior investigating officer George Oldfield was holding some vital information back out of the tape, which convinced him unequivocally that was from the killer.
Oh, I see. So this is his own team
Yeah.
are assuming the boss knows something that he's not telling the rest of you.
Yeah.
So it doesn't get leaked.
Presumably so.
So where's the trust in a team like that?
Well, there wasn't any. There wasn't any. And to be quite honest with you, it became just a mundane task because I certainly, you know, it's very difficult to raise your enthusiasm when you feel that, you know, you're not part of the team, or you're part of this team, but there's another team upstairs that's really not connected to you. And which is why I always made sure every officer that went out had all the information, so they could, you know, recognise, identify a potential killer if they come across them. But yeah, that was how it felt. And of course, it transpired that there was no rational basis to say that those letters and those tapes came from the killer. None whatsoever. And that undermined the whole investigation.
I want to come back to the humble side of this in a minute. That's extremely interesting from my point of view, because one of my roles latterly was for my sins in management, so I know exactly the type of scenario you're describing, although life was not at risk. But yeah, I mean, that's something which I'm sure a lot of people would be familiar with.
I mean, I'll give you an example. On the Wendy-speakes murder.
So this is going forward. So this is now 1992 or whatever. Four. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Fine. 94.
96.
You're in charge.
No, 94, because it was 2000 when it was 6 years after.
That's right. Yeah.
94.
Yeah.
Yes.
What was your role in this? You were SIO.
I was a senior investigating officer, detective superintendent. Now, it become very in vogue to have an offender profiler. So we got an offender profiler, Richard Badcock. Lovely man. Absolutely lovely. He only lives, he doesn't live far from where I live. Bump into him sometimes at the supermarket. And Richard was the offender profiler. And of course, within that murder, there was an issue over shoes. She was not wearing the shoes when she was sexually attacked and murdered that she was wearing when she came home. They were downstairs where she would normally leave them. And there were other issues of fetish. So he said to me, did Richard Badcock, well, it all starts off, he said, when you're about 18 months old, you're crawling around the floor and you became anally transfixed. So I'm going, I don't remember that. And then you find your mother's shoes, and that's how you develop a fetish. I said to him, Richard, I really do appreciate the information that you're giving me, but I can't go in that room and tell them that. They'll laugh at me. So, you know, it's got to be based evidentially. And of course, we all know about the failures of using offender profilers as an absolute god and going down the wrong road. What I did find him very useful of it was a non-police perspective, looking at the circumstances. I remember one thing he said to me when he looked at it, he said, he's not a beast, you know. I said, well, he obviously is, but I think I know what you mean. And he said, she wasn't frightened of him. He said, Wendy-speakes wasn't frightened of him because she was talking to him on the doorstep, and that was seen by the chap at Greens across the road. And he walked round the back, and then he came back round the front. So if she was frightened of him, she had ample opportunity to close the door. So you're not looking for somebody who looks, you know, like the two-horned demon that, you know, that people think is the only type of person that could commit this crime. And that's another thing with detectives that you haven't got to do. Because with the Michael Sams case, who could carry out, this audacious act of kidnapping somebody and escaping from the police? He's got to be an ex-SAS survivalist. And he turns out to be a one-legged toolmaker from Newark. So, you've got to take these pictures out of your mind and just concentrate on what the evidence says. And of course, when West Midlands, on the fateful night of Crime Watch, they got the same phone call we got. And there were 7 priorities, 7 being the lowest. When they said he'd only got 1 leg, the person who rang him in, which was his son, he went down to priority 7. But when that same call came into our incident room, priority 1.
And the disparity was due to what?
Due to an individual's perception that a man with 1 leg couldn't have committed this crime.
Right.
Whereas one of my sergeants, Tim Grogan, said, don't bother me that. He said, best burglar on Gipton Estate in Leeds, he had no legs. He said, they got him chopped off by a tram in Blackpool, and he was the one who went down. So again, making assumptions. Oh, he couldn't have done it, when in actual fact we're wrong. It was strange that in 24 hours after we'd arrested him, he went back up to priority 1 in West Midlands.
Now, this is something else that intrigues us. It's the way that these people become portrayed, whether or not that is by the police, and that is then picked up and amplified by the media, or whether it's the media that starts the ball rolling and the police are then fighting a rearguard action and trying to limit the public's expectation of just how dastardly this particular individual might be. I think it was said quite recently with Peter-Sutcliffe that it was only when the epithet Yorkshire Ripper was coined that the press had something to latch onto. They had a story. And similarly with Wearside Jack, that was just a title that was bestowed on this anonymous individual out there somewhere. And it gave the story a handle, which is great if you're writing copy. How does that affect a police investigation? Is it that binary? Thinking back to the Yorkshire Ripper incident room, was it that binary? The George Oldfield and his coterie of managers, they were all there in the white hats, and then the Ripper was the antithesis of them, and he was playing games with them, and he was the baddie wearing the black hat and the bandana.
To some extent, yes, and of course the stories were abound about how the Yorkshire Ripper disemboweled his victims and all sorts of strange stories. A lot of them, were just, started from word to word, and it got added on until it became something that was nothing like the first thing that was said. But yes, it does. That's one of the things, when you talk about the Black Panther, they tried it with Sams the night that he got away with the £175,000. The headline in one of the papers next morning was Phantom of the Fog. Now, the one thing that Michael Sams is very proud of is that he's not known as the Yorkshire Ripper or the Black Panther. And he's actually said that. When people walk past my cell, they go, that's Michael Sams. But it does gather with it, it garners a mystery of, this person, the Black Panther, the Yorkshire Ripper, as, more than just a criminal who's committing a series of crimes. And the media do wind it up a bit because it makes for more interesting reading. I
just want to sort of clarify something there. You were at the post-mortems on first 3 Ripper victims?
Sorry, second and third.
Second and third. And one of the disparities that struck me reading this, which is Michael Bilton's book, and some of the things that were written afterwards by, I think, the fingerprint expert who was one of the first to arrive with Socko. That contrast with what Sutcliffe says he did to the women's bodies when he confessed. From what you saw, was he completely deranged when he attacked those women? Or did he, as he intimates in his confession, just take the necessary steps to silence them?
Well, the necessary steps to silence them was the blows to the head. Generally 2 blows to the head. But then there would be a secondary weapon. Now, Irene Richardson she had suffered a cut to her stomach, and you've got to remember that the pressure of the body is holding your intestines in. So it doesn't take much for it to burst out. She wasn't disemboweled. And also, a victim who hasn't been found for any length of time, the gases build up in the body. And yes, the intestines could spill out as the body's decaying. Second victim, Emily Jackson, had been stabbed 51 times. Excuse me. Emily Jackson had been stabbed 51 times in the front, chest and back. Some of those were so forceful they'd gone through her sternum. So I would call that a frenzied attack in anybody's book, not just sufficient to silence them. There was clearly, anger there. Whereas others, it'd be a blow to the head and a couple of stab wounds. Some victims were repeatedly stabbed through the same wound. So yeah, it was frenzied. I can't describe it any other way that there were frenzied attacks, but he used the blows to the head, which rendered them unconscious or semi-unconscious, and then he attacked them. Probably dragged them to a place where he had a little bit more privacy. But certainly with a couple of them, he had lifted the bra over the breasts, up over the breast, which was another sort of linking factor. None of which individually, but when you took together 2 different weapons and the style, then yeah, there were some quite significant linking factors.
I'm going to try not to dwell too much on the actual Ripper investigation. It's fascinating. There's so much material in there. I want to take it forwards, but just before I do that, the relationship between the investigation team and prostitutes and women in general, which was prevalent in the 1970s, and Lord knows, I don't know. I mean, maybe it still is the case that the evidence of a woman who sells sex or a man who sells sex, come to that, is worth less than the evidence that's provided by somebody who doesn't. Was that a significant limiting factor on the investigation?
Yes. Yes, in some cases. Again, with in some cases where people were interviewed. Remember the first 2 cases were Anna Regulski in Keighley and Olive Smelt in Halifax. And Olive Smelt was dismissed as an old slapper. Very offended by the comment that was made. I won't say who said it to her, but it was a senior officer. And she, you know, very offended. She was a victim of the Yorkshire Ripper.
And a, quote, old slapper because she liked to go to the pub without a husband.
Yeah.
And was that state of mind driving the inquiry?
I don't think that was amongst the rank and file officers. You treated everybody the same. I mean, Marcella Claxton, I saw her the night she was attacked. I mean, she had horrific cuts to her head. And I dealt with Marcella before for crime matters, not prostitution, but I was well aware that she was involved in prostitution. But she couldn't remember a great deal. But then again, I mean, she'd got really, but we saw her at hospital. And we see again, she was on Soldiers Field, which was the same field that Irene Richardson, his body was found. So, you know, you've got to right near Roundy Park.
Yeah.
So, you know, you've got to start thinking. Same as Dr.
So Marcella was found first, wasn't she? And Irene Richardson was found later. He went back to the same location.
Yeah. Dr. Bandara, again, they couldn't quite grip that, you know, this could be the same man. So she couldn't remember anything.
Whereas the evidence was telling you it's the same MO, it's the same weapon,
if somebody's struck
location
on the head with a hammer, you know, you've got to be thinking, right, well, okay, why didn't he go on and use a secondary weapon? And maybe it was disturbed. So we maybe can't connect it 100%, but it's got to be in our mind, right? We put it on that side there, and we're looking at that, we're looking at that as well. And of course, and then the last victim,
Jacqueline Hill.
Jacqueline Hill, yeah, Jacqueline Hill.
That was in Headingley, behind.
Yeah, not far, yeah, but behind the Arndale in Headingley.
Right, yeah.
Again, I worked on that, and again, it was inconceivable. It could be anybody else. Because none of these crimes ever involved any theft either. So sometimes, right, why is that person being attacked? Right, we know now that he only had sex with Ellen Ricker. So there wasn't any obvious sexual interference with the bodies. So you've got negative factors which can become positive factors. So she hadn't been robbed, she hadn't been sexually assaulted. She's been attacked with a weapon on the head, right? So we've got to have that in mind.
Did you hear anything about the peculiar clothing that made for himself?
No, not until afterwards, till it was revealed in the book. There was, although I was.
Do you think that pointed towards a sexual motive? You know, perhaps he was in a position where he might have, you know, been dressed in such a way as he could rape a victim if he wished, or he was in a position where he could masturbate over a victim and then very quickly make a getaway.
Quite possible. I've never been 100% sure of his motivation. One thing I do dismiss is the voices from God in Bingley Cemetery. But the progression with him seemed to have started. He was very much of a mummy's boy. And Sonia Zerma was, I think, probably one of his first real girlfriends. Then they split up and he saw her in a pub with another guy, an Italian chap, I think. And that's when he started and went down into Bradford to attack a prostitute, which didn't work out on the first occasion. I mean, he was actually found with a knife and a hammer or something similar and was done for going equipped for crime.
And Manningham Lane and Lum Lane
Yeah.
are really close to where he was
Yeah.
living in Heaton at the time.
Yeah. And on one occasion he picked a prostitute up, and then he went back to her place. He couldn't perform a sexual act, so he said...
she ridiculed him, and that compounded his antagonism towards prostitutes.
He said, well, I'll pay you anyway. So he gets a £20 note. She says, I haven't got any change. So she took him to the garage to get some change, and this guy, a big bloke, comes out and chases him off. And then after that, he sees the same prostitute in a pub, who then ridicules him. So there's somewhere where he's building up a hate of women.
£20 at the time would have been half a week's wages, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, a lot of money. He stabbed Emily Jackson 51 times. Now there is a thing called picarism, which is sexual stabbing, where the actual stabbing provides arousal, and so that could well have been, again, sexually related. But of course, whatever was going on in his mind, those are the parts in the dark corners of his mind. The actual motivation is never revealed. That
I would imagine that sexual arousal would be fairly one-sided, wouldn't it? It would be on the part of the person who was doing the stabbing, not on the part of the person who was being stabbed.
That's correct. And so I don't think that you know.
So it's a sadistic trait.
Yes, there could well have been a sexual element behind it. That there was some sexual arousal by what he was doing, which is why I was drawn back to do it again.
So the delving into the same wounds in different directions with a long instrument.
Yeah, they used to find where women would go out shopping, and then they get home, they find they've got a puncture wound in the bottom, you know, where somebody'd gone and stabbed them. It's not a common thing, but again, this sexual deviant part of crime is not common anyway.
So you were talking about homes earlier on. Let me just talk about computerisation, right? So there's a couple of ways of looking at this. You've got 650,000 individual bits of data that have come out of the Ripper inquiry, and they're all stacked up there in Millgarth, and they've had to reinforce the floor of the incident room to bear the weight, right? How would a computer have made the job easier if, for instance, someone had arrived with one in a van and installed it in 1979?
It would have changed the whole dimension of the inquiry, but only if it was started on that. To back convert is very difficult. And of course, the wonderful thing about Holmes is, to make it interesting for tenders, there were several different companies made the Holmes system. So when we were working on the Stephanie Slater, Julie Dart link case, we needed to link with their system. They weren't compatible. They couldn't talk to each other. They were both home systems. So we sent our computers down there because we had a bigger data base than they did, so that we could link.
So this is two systems in 1994. One's in West Yorkshire, one is in Birmingham, West Midlands.
Yes.
They're both called Holmes.
Yes.
But they can't communicate. And this isn't because of a lack of internet, which there really wasn't at the time, was there? This is because the two systems are set up differently.
Yes. But
they're called the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. So how much of a barrier was that to an effective investigation? And how did you overcome it?
Well, we overcame that by sending down some of our Holmes machines. So they took theirs out because they were in the early stages, and they used our machines, so we were all off the database. But they were quite cute, because if you leave a document open, you can't search it. So we didn't know what was happening on a day-to-day basis down there, because they weren't closing the... you've got like your senior officer's log, your policy log, you know, what you're doing. And they left it as an open document so we couldn't see it.
Was that professional one-upmanship, or was that just very poor procedure?
I think it was done on purpose. But of course, there are non-technical ways to overcome these technical issues also. So I sent an officer, because we did have West Yorkshire officers working with them. So I sent an officer who used to just, his job all day was to go around and sit in all the briefings. And then he'd ring me up and tell me what was happening.
It's called manual backup.
Yeah, you know, they never cottoned on. It was this strange guy who just came, sits in back at briefings, and yeah, he was one of my detectives.
That sort of negates the use of a computer system to an extent, doesn't it?
It does.
The free and accurate flow of information between two organisations with a common purpose, but you basically have to have someone sitting there to make sure they're playing the game by your rules.
For all intents and purposes, if information came in about somebody called Michael Sams, it would all be linked. Right. It would all be linked. But in terms of policy direction on where they were going, because they decided they would prioritise areas, we had no idea. I mean, they ended up, and Tom Cook, who was our ACC crime, was the overall in charge. I'm in charge of the Julie Dart investigation. They've got Superintendent down there, Mick Williams, in charge of the Stephanie Slater kidnapping. And then Tom Cook's in charge overall. And of course, they were going right, and we got South Yorkshire wanted to be involved. So they just set up an incident room. They wanted to be involved. And consequently, they had these areas where you could work, and we couldn't work any within 30 miles of this South Yorkshire incident room, which meant our own incident room was within 30 miles. So there's all this, the politics. Computers will deal with the facts, but the politics, once it gets involved in politics, it became difficult.
I'm just wondering if it was blind luck that because of the politics, the Michael Sams investigation didn't turn into another Yorkshire Ripper. It was all there, wasn't it? The components, systems that didn't communicate with each other, people who didn't cooperate with each other, people who didn't trust each other.
Yeah. Well,
how did it not turn into a fiasco on the scale of the Ripper inquiry?
And the reason it didn't was because of Tom Cook, our ACC crime. A man of immense, you know, I totally admired Tom Cook, totally admired him. He once said to me, I was in CID, you know, for 6 months before I got promoted. I said, that ain't called being in CID, Mr. Cook. That's called having a look. But he had a wealth of common sense. And he'd get Mick Williams and me together and say, right, I'm going to put a bottle of scotch on that table and you're not coming out of this room before you sort it out. It never got to that. But we had...
But if you had a difference, or if you, before you solved the crime, was that the...
Yeah, Tom Cook was the mediator, and
okay.
So he kept it online. But it was like going to the headmaster and saying, no, they're not letting us see this. And yeah, the problem we had was a lot of the detectives in the West Midlands had been on the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad. And who investigated? The West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, or West Yorkshire Police. And they'd say to us, yeah, you started investigating corruption in our Serious Crime Squad, and then you were sort of investigating our expenses and girlfriends.
There was some bad blood there.
Yeah.
I'm wondering what it was like when Colin Sampson came from Nottinghamshire to take over as Chief Constable of West Yorkshire, because of course his report was one of the two that pilloried what had happened in the Ripper inquiry. Did he get a rough ride because of that?
No.
His recommendations were taken on board as well, weren't they?
Yeah.
Was that because West Yorkshire decided they needed to put their house in order?
They could not afford another Yorkshire Ripper. You know, they had to bow and say, yeah, we've got to take on board lessons learned. We all knew they had to. And the only positive way to move forward was to say, we accept that mistakes were made, but what we need to do is ensure that they never happen again.
So yeah, around about the same time, in fact, this was sort of concurrent, wasn't it? Was the Clive
Barwell.
Clive Barwell, and an attack which I suppose came hot on the heels of Peter-Sutcliffe being sent down for 20 life terms, was this attack in the Broadmarsh Centre in Nottingham, and then there was an attack as well in Leeds, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Very similar. Young woman in a car. She's actually hijacked in her own car, and then she's driven somewhere in fear of her life. She's seriously sexually assaulted, and then the perpetrator gets away. You were starting on that investigation from ground zero. There was a computer system of a sort. How did the Clive Barwell investigation not follow the same pattern as the Peter-Sutcliffe investigation?
I think because we'd got fingerprints. We'd got fingerprints, and the fingerprints were a key, because it was inconceivable but not impossible that he'd never been convicted before, but likely he had. Therefore, we needed to search his fingerprints, and he had lived in our area. It turned out afterwards, which is how we found him. So they focused on, the team was focusing on the fingerprints and looking for people who, you know, to put forward. So it was the fingerprint search. From the, again, there were cooperation issues because we contacted Nottingham, because we think this is, you know, connected. They promised us so many detectives and we didn't get them to work on their end, so we went down and worked on their end. You can't be frustrated because you're not getting cooperation, and if you can't get it from somebody else, you do it yourself. It's as simple as that. But you know, that was just one individual who thought, oh, this isn't going to go anywhere. But she was very lucky to get away with her life, because he clearly, he asked if she got a lighter at one stage, and she could smell the petrol. I think he was going to set the fire, set the car on fire. And of course, one of ours had ended up thrown her tied up in the canal. So she only survived because she stood on a rock in the canal, which kept her chin above water, and till she got help. So he was at the top end, was Barwell, but yeah, the hit from him came through fingerprints. Because, and then when we investigate it further, he's in prison. So then when we contact the prison authorities, now we're in prison on that day, the day of the Nottingham attack. Well, he couldn't have been, because we connected him. So we had to delve further, and that's when we discovered that the way that they were operating with him was very low. He was managing a pub with his girlfriend, and he had to go back on a night, and he could come and go when he pleased. So, you know, it was just so lax. And of course, it was quite easy from where he was to could have driven, committed the crime and gone back, which is exactly what he did. So it wasn't cut and dried, but of course got there in the end.
One of those favourite journalistic expressions is a catalogue of errors, right? You kind of wait till you get a decent story, and is it a catalogue of errors story? Yeah, it's a catalogue of errors, so everybody goes with the catalogue of errors line. It's always intrigued me how this catalogue actually starts and how it is allowed to build up. Does it start with one mistake by the police. They generally seem to be in the firing line for this probably because they're most easily recognised by the public. I don't know. How does that start, and how does it become the catalogue?
It shouldn't do, because if you operate the home system properly, I, as a senior investigating officer, will document all my policy decisions. Those policy decisions will have resulted from discussion with my management team. Right, so I just don't decide, oh, he's got a Geordie accent, right, that's it, done, finished. And that document is there. When we get so far into an investigation, you are then subject to a review. Now that's interesting, because when I was reviewed on the Julie Dart case, Julie Dart's body was found in a field, and there had been a chap walking in Alsatian the night before. So I wasn't happy that that was sufficient. So my elimination criteria was much wider than that. All right, my elimination criteria was for the whole period she'd gone missing. The review team said, well, I'd have done it 24 hours. I'd have done it from the time she was found to after when the dark guy walked the dog. Well, she'd been in the field several days, as it turned out. So that would have been a failure, because if we'd have gone and interviewed him and said, where were you on that day, it could have produced evidence to say he was working in his tool shop. So you have to be very careful on how you set your criteria.
It sounds a little bit like the Jean Jordan murder in Manchester, where her handbag was only discovered, I think, 2 weeks after her murder, maybe longer than that, maybe 3 or 4 weeks even, by somebody who was working on an allotment.
Yes.
Because the radius of the search had been drawn inside where Sutcliffe had thrown the handbag.
Yeah.
Is that just bad luck that happens?
Well, I always...
If you were following procedure, would that, I say you, if the police were following procedure, would that handbag have been found on day one?
It would if I'd have done it. I always say, start big, you can go smaller. But if you start small, you can't go bigger, because outside your search area is now contaminated. So I dealt with a case, and this chap had attacked his girlfriend, his ex-girlfriend and boyfriend, in a house in Hales, one crime scene. She ran out of the house, ran down the street onto a piece grassed area in front of Compton Arms pub, and then he cut her throat there. So I had a crime scene there, and then the whole street connecting the two, right? And that was it. You know, I used to tell people, right, if somebody, don't bother about you disrupting traffic, right? It's your crime scene, and until you finish with it, that's it. You know, I mean, we had people, again, another case where a guy was murdered in a building that was under construction, renovation, and you know, I'm getting pressure off me from the, well, I'm going to get my men back to work. So I said, they won't be going back to work, because I said, health and safety. There's blood contamination in there, so they can't work in there, and until I've finished, it won't get cleaned up.
Go back to Sam's, start big and get small. So in terms of physical area with investigation, is that the same with time? So you start with a big time frame and then you reduce it?
Yes, you can do that, yeah.
Right.
You'd start big and go small, depending on the facts, but you're also looking for other relevant information. So once we'd caught Sam's, the investigation hadn't stopped, because he was denying the murder and actually said, the other man did this, the other man did that. So I set up two teams. One, I want you to pull out all the evidence that there is another man, and I want you to pull out evidence that suggests there isn't another man. And eventually they came together and said, now they're into another man. It all comes from Sam's. And of course, so then I knew that finding the money was crucial, because Sam's is going, the other man's out there spending the money. And I'm raking through one day, and this farmer refers to seeing this guy with a limp at this bridge, which in railway terms is the Mecca. It's called Stoke Summit, and it is where the Mallard, I think, broke the speed record in 1937 or something like that. And this guy's got a limp, and it was foggy. So we threatened to put Sam's on an ID parade. Anyway, he said, yeah, we're him. Yeah, we're at bridge. What were you doing? Train spotting. Well, it was foggy. And apart from a few goods trains, they all went past Endior Garden. So that's where we were looking, because that fitted in. It was after he'd got the money before he got arrested. And that's how we then went to look there for the money. And of course, then finding the money. And it was, I always say to my team, if you're asked a question, you don't know the answer, we use the big Billy Goat Gruff. Oh, I can't answer that. Ask my big brother who was coming over the rickety-rackety bridge. And one of the officers was asked about the fingerprint on the money. And was it Michael Sam's? And he said, no. Then, of course, big Billy Goat Gruff came me. Now it was Michael Sam's fingerprint. So there were nobody else's prints on that money? No. And of course, and that collapsed it. So where's the other man's money? Because what Sam's did, it was rather clever. Me and the other man went to that bridge. And it was like a box with two keys, right? So he blindfolded, I blindfolded him and drove to the bridge. Then he blindfolded me, and then he went and buried the money. So I know the general location, but I don't know where he buried the money.
This is all a figment of Michael Sam's imagination.
Oh, he'd got a very furtive imagination. But, and this was it, you see, you just, and it was. I mean, Paul Britton, who was the offender profile on that, it was very useful on the tactics on interview with him. And he would come up with an answer, and then he'd think about it, and then he'd change it on the next interview. So I said, right, we need to take handwriting tests. There's all these letters being sent. I mean, it's the first time ever, because he was left-handed. One of the letters, the first time ever from handwriting experts, it's his handwriting. Because they'd normally go, yes, there's a 70% possibility it could be somebody else or whatever. No, it's his handwriting. But what we did was, he was dyslexic. So we picked out all the words he'd misspelled. I mean, like idea, he spelled I-D-E-A-R. And there were many words that he'd misspelled. So we did first handwriting test, 23 mistakes. He got all wrong, and 19 exactly the same as they were wrong in the letters. So when we get him to go back in to do the next lot, which was from the British Rail extortion, he's got a dictionary signed cell. You won't catch me out this time, he says. So he went in, he did the spelling test again, he got them all wrong. Quite simply because, as far as he was concerned, they weren't spelt wrong. That's how you spell them.
So you've got all these data points. I can see how it's building up, and you're using, with him in custody, being interviewed, offender profiling to assist you in your interviews with your suspect. You've brought in a handwriting analyst who uniquely has said, yes, absolutely 100%, this is his handwriting. Yeah. All of those techniques.
Of course, his answer to, I have to tell you, his answer to that one was, The other man dictated me, he told me what to write.
They call it embedded schizophrenia in the case of Sutcliffe. You know,
Yeah.
it's like schizophrenia, but only when he chooses to be schizophrenic.
Exactly.
Yeah, so you've got these techniques, and they're being used, and they're techniques which they were available at the time of the Ripper inquiry, but they seem to have developed, they seem to have matured as techniques. Is that true? You know, in the sort of 15 odd years between Ripper and Sams, that they've actually, techniques like handwriting analysis and offender profiling have developed more credibility because they've shown maturity and they've been successful elsewhere.
Well, I think offender profiling, you know, takes its roots from Cracker, to be quite honest with you. And, you know, like, then with the Michael Sams case, the first thing the press asked me is, have you got an offender profiler? So you feel obliged to get one because, well, they had one on that one. It's how you use them. And like I say, they're a good non-police perspective. And the Paul Britton was excellent on interview strategy. He said, right, Sams, you must never interview Sams. You leave that down to my DI, Paul Maxwell and Tim Grogan, the DS. And they can't give him anything. So if he wants something, they've got to say, I'll have to ask Mr. Taylor. So I then actually became known by the team as the dark, shadowy figure, because I was in the background, and I will have to ask Mr. Taylor that. So that you're in control. So it's like you are in competition with him, but you're not in the same room, you know, so it's like a game of chess. So, and he would say, right, if you want to get an answer, you just don't ask that one question, because he's not going to give you the answer you want. You might have to ask 6 or 7 different questions. So we'd limit the topics to maybe 3 or 4 on each interview, so they could drill down on those questions. And, you know, you're not going, oh, well, I've got another 20 questions to ask. But just drill down with him, which worked quite successfully. But what he would do is he'd do what we call the deny and confess. He'd deny it, then we'd thought about it, he'd confess it, but come up with what he thought was a credible answer.